In episode 7 of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill from Christianity Today, the primary talking point in this podcast episode is the church's leadership. Should you have a group of leaders leading the church, or should you have one man at the top, the lead pastor, as we tend to call that individual? In the case of Mars Hill, they began with a plurality of leaders that led the church, and it led them to the heights of that church's ministry. It eventually morphed into a lead guy, which was Mark Driscoll, and of course that began the descent and the ultimate fall of Mars Hill Church. In this review of that series, I want to talk about the leadership structure of your church. So I trust that you would be able to evaluate it, speak into it, or be encouraged by the good work that the Lord is doing. Hello everyone, Rick Thomas here. I am reviewing Christianity Today's podcast series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. This is episode number 7, and the title of their episode is State of Emergency. Now this episode begins with Mark threatening to beat up some of the leaders in his church, for real. Mike Hosper of Christianity Today plays this soundbite of Mark talking about beating up a couple of elders who he eventually fired. And as he is talking, the church congregation is laughing, but they're not laughing in a fearful, nervous type laughter. It's almost expected laughter and normal laughter, as though there's nothing wrong with it. And as I was listening to that soundbite, it was just eerie. And then he continued to talk about kicking these two elders off the bus and running over them because they got off mission. And then he further clarified by saying that he had no qualms about the growing number of unfortunate souls that were piling up behind the bus. This soundbite that they played is the best articulation of why Mars Hill Church does not exist today. It was sad to listen to. It was heart-wrenching as it defames God and it weakens the body of Christ. But it also explains the danger of an out-of-control pastor with no accountability. And accountability is critical within a church context. In fact, Mike Hosper talked about the tension between accountability and speed, or accountability and production. We have a lot of things to do, and so we don't have time for accountability. Should we slow things down to have more accountability, or should we dismiss stringent accountability because we have work to do for Jesus? Well, one of the ways that you can think about that is the structure of the church. If you have a lead pastor sort, a de facto leader like Mark Driscoll, well then it could be very low on accountability. But then you could have a leadership team that could be very high on accountability, and so each church has to make those decisions. There are basically 3 types of church leadership teams. One is a plurality of elders. And when I say plurality, I mean that all of them are equal. It is a flat line here. And even if you have a lead pastor, he's not out in front, but he blends back into the elder board of the leadership team. Now, this team moves by consensus, and it can move at a slower pace, but there tends to be more accountability and care with the plurality. Now, another leadership model within the church is a plurality, but we call that a first among equals, meaning think about geese flying through the air, that it is a plurality, but we have one person on point. And so it's kind of a hybrid between a lead pastor and a true plurality. And again, this is called first among equals. And then the third type of model and this is what Mars Hill morphed into, is the lead pastor, where and the worst case scenario of this is a person who could do whatever he wants. Now, there can be a lead pastor who is the de facto leader, and he's part of a leadership team or other pastors on staff, but he really is the lead guy, and everyone knows that. Now, there's not anything necessarily wrong with those 3 models if everybody is operating with humility. But if humility is not in play, well, obviously it can get into all kinds of problems, which is what happened with Mars Hill. Now, interesting enough, Mars Hill began with a plurality of leadership. And then it shifted into first among equals, where Mark Driscoll was on point. And then eventually, Mark Driscoll was the leader, and there was virtually no accountability. And so, again, people go back and forth as to what working model is the right one as far as the pastoral team of a local church. But there's another type of model that needs to be included in this conversation. And so you have the work model, and that determines if you have a lead pastor, an elder team, a plurality, or first among equals. That is the work model for the team and what everybody sees. But there's also a sanctification model as well. You see, we are a dichotomy. We work, we have behaviors, but yet those behaviors and the people that we are and how we represent ourselves on various teams flows out of our hearts and who we are at our soul level or our heart level. And so when you think about church leaders, you want to think about the model, the working model that everybody sees, but you also want to think about the sanctification model. Who is providing soul care for these leaders that make up the leadership team? Who is caring for your pastor? That is an excellent question. What about their spouses? Who is bringing care to them? Because the pastor and his wife are one flesh. How do you know your leaders are doing well personally or maritally or within their families if they have children? Perhaps your church is a large church of a couple thousand people, and you're sequestered off into a small group, and there is a distance between you and the leadership. And in a lot of churches, a lot of large churches, it can be that way, and that's not wrong. And so you don't know. But somebody needs to be speaking into these leaders' lives and caring for their wives and caring for their families. If you were to be part of a local church and you're going to soon be a member, let's say you go through a series of membership classes, I would ask this question. I would ask whoever's teaching the class, who's providing soul care for our leaders? Who's caring for their wives? Who is caring for their families? I don't want to just know what kind of leadership we have, plurality, first among equals, or just the lead guy. Of course, I want to know that, but I also want to ask the sanctification question as well. Because if there is a disconnect between the leaders and the church people, and we're not into each other's lives, you can have authoritarianism. And if you have authoritarianism, then it's going to be a cancer that will spread throughout the church. And like Mars Hill, it could be the church's demise. As you address or assess whether you have an authoritative culture, authoritarian culture in your church, there are characteristics of it. There are some things that you can see to discern if you have an authoritarian pastor, authoritarian leadership team, or an authoritarian culture in DNA. Let me share with you 5 characteristics of an authoritarian church model. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just 5 things to kind of get you thinking as you examine your church to see what kind of church you have. One characteristic is, as I've been saying, the pastor is not accessible to care, either for him or his family. That there is this separation, and he is not receiving care from the church, soul care from the church, nor his wife or his family. If the pastor is not assimilated into the church, that is a red flag. A second characteristic of a potential authoritarian church is the pastor is not open to critique. I'm not talking about harsh critique or proud critique. I'm talking about a person who, out of a heart of humility, observes things that's going on, let's say in the pastor's life or maybe the pastor's sermon or whatever, not the nitpicky person that comes up every Sunday with something critical to say, but honest and humble critique, but yet the pastor is not open to it. If anyone is not open to your assessments and observations, whether they are correct or not, that's another issue. We can talk about the correctness of it later, but being open to those conversations is absolutely essential. A third characteristic of a potential authoritarian church is the pastor creates a culture of fear or inhibition or couragelessness, where people lose their courage. They are deflated. They would not dare go to their pastor and critique him, that he's not entreatable, that you're not drawn to him, or you know through personal experience that it will not go well. And so it creates a culture of fear or inhibition, or what I call couragelessness. And so the pastor is not accessible to sanctification care. The pastor is not open to humble observations and corrective care. The pastor creates a culture of fear, inhibition, or couragelessness. Number 4, there is a growing divide between the leader and the laity. The head and the body should be assimilated. You always want to be moving this direction. Husbands and wives want to move this way. Congregations and leadership want to move this way. Christ the head and we the body want to always be moving this way. But if the gap is growing, if there is a fracture in the church and it continues to grow, then that could be a sign. It is a sign that something is wrong. It may be a sign that there's an authoritarianism that creates this polarization. And then the 5th characteristic in my non-exhaustive list is that the back door of the church and the front door of the church are the same size. And what I mean by that is there's just as many people leaving as coming in. And that happens in a lot of churches. There's no staying power. There's no shelf life for the average congregant. They come for a year or two, and then because of the authoritativeness, they just have enough of it, and then they leave. And so we've had 10 new church members to come to our church who joined our church this month, but we had 15 to leave. And so when the back door and the front door are about the same size, and there were a lot of people that were leaving Mars Hill Church, and there's nothing hardly you can do about it. I mean, they're frustrated, they're hurt, they're damaged, they leave, they just don't want to have anything to do with it any longer. That may be a sign of an authoritative church. Now, if you have an authoritative pastor or think you have an authoritative pastor and you sense some of the things that I'm communicating, or maybe you have added a few things to the list as you have been listening to my short list of 5 things, well, then you want to consider responding to the authoritarian. Now, this is where it gets pretty sticky here, and I know this is a hard conversation to have with people, but if a person is doing wrong, we do want to model Matthew 18, starting in verse 15, including our pastors. They are not exempt from this. And so if you have a pastor who may be going in a direction that it just doesn't seem right, there has to be a conversation that must happen between him and somebody, or maybe multiple people. But here is a 5-point sequential list of how you can think about approaching someone, whether it's the pastor or maybe any other person in any other relationship that you have. Point number 1, can you overlook what you perceive as wrong? I mean, can you overlook it? You're playing the long game with this person and you want to continue to interact with them, have a relationship with them. You just don't, there's some things you can just overlook because, again, you're playing a longer game and you have this plan and this process and this goal in mind with them. And so rather than speaking to everything that you see wrong, sometimes you can overlook things. And so if you can overlook it, if it's not so egregious or heinous, maybe you can just overlook it and then it just stops there. Number 2, if you can't overlook it, then you must take the issue to the Lord. And so you want to spend time with God in the Scriptures, pouring your heart out and then allowing the Scriptures to pour over your mind, and spend as much time as you need talking to God about this and searching the Scriptures, because you can't overlook it. Point number 3, if you can't dismiss it, and after talking to God, now you have to bring it to the person that's involved. Now, the best case scenario is you go directly to them, that you don't talk to anybody else. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to chat with somebody else, but in a best case scenario, you just go directly to that person and you bring your observations and hopefully you can work it out. Sometimes people sense the need that they need to get clarity. And again, that's not really wrong with the heart motivation of redemption and reconciliation. It's not gossip and slander necessarily to talk about someone to someone who has the ability, has the competence to be able to advise you and care for you. So sometimes gaining that kind of clarity can be beneficial if we're not talking about gossip and slander, but it's a heart motivated by something else, a desire to reconcile with this person, but I am appropriately suspicious of my own observations, and so I want to talk to someone else before I engage this individual. With that said, best case scenario is just make a straight line to the individual and talk to them. And then number 4, if the person is unwilling to talk, or if they are dismissive, or if they are defensive, or if they flip the conversation around and make it your fault, that's called gaslighting. You go in the meeting to bring corrective care to an individual, a pastor or someone else, and you walk out of the meeting and it's like, oh, it's my fault. And somewhere in that meeting, it got flipped around and they gaslit you. And so if they're unwilling to talk, if they are dismissive, if they're defensive, if they flip the conversation on you, you may need to go to someone else with the hope of finding solutions to this, because it just didn't work when you went directly to them. And then finally, point number 5, if the leader's sin is too great, and in Mark Driscoll's case, I mean, it was great. I mean, the things that they're communicating here are just, honestly, they're just hard to fathom. And so if the leader's sin is too great, you can't overlook it. He will not change. It may become a conscience issue for you to where you will have to leave. You can't go there Sunday in and Sunday out, because you start sinning your brains out. I mean, you go and listen to him and you know all these things are wrong, but yet he won't respond to any of them. You have sought outside counsel to make sure that your observations are in line with the gospel, and there's no change, and you go and listen to him week in and week out. Eventually you may start sinning, and it could be that you start creating division within that church. It may be that the only thing that you can do at that point is to turn it over to the Lord and leave for conscience sake. And so that's point number 5. If the leader's sin is too great, you can't overlook it. He's not changing. You may have to leave. As I wrap up this podcast, there's been a lot of negativity here about authoritarian pastors and some hard things for us to think about and wrestle through. I want to leave by giving you a 3-point list, 3 characteristics of what a good leader is. I want to finish on a positive note, because I would imagine what I'm about to share with you exemplifies most of the pastors of the folks who are listening to this video, that this is your pastor that I'm describing. But this is a mirror, so I want to hold up a mirror, 3 characteristics of a good pastor, and as you look at that, does that mirror who your pastor is? And I trust that it does. Number 1 is humility. Humility is the foundational characteristic. It is the bedrock. It is as low, pun intended, it is as low as you can go. That is the foundational characteristic, and it sets the stage for everything else. It stacks of the leader, of all of his, whoever he is, stacks on top of this foundation of humility. So everything that he thinks, everything that he says, everything that he does flows out of humility. And if humility is the foundation of who he is, then that does set the stage for a lot of good things to happen. So humility is number 1 as far as a human characteristic is concerned. Number 2 is authoritative. Now think about this. You see, his authority flows out of his humility. If his authority flows out of his humility, then it will not only flow well, but it will be received well. If his authority flows out of selfish ambition, then it's not going to flow well, and it will not feel right to you. It will be harsh and unkind, and you would be run over by the bus, to use the illustration in this episode. And the thing that I want you to understand is that what we don't want to do is to conflate a bad pastor with authority. If you conflate those two things and throw them both out, then you would be wrong. Throw the bad pastor out, but we don't throw authority out. And in our culture today, and we see this with a lot of people, that they don't believe in authority, don't recognize authority, they dismiss authority, they reject it and speak against it. For example, if a child was reared in a home of an abusive, authoritative dad, he could very well kick authority to the curb. He conflates his dad with authority, and he kicks authority to the curb. We have zillions of people in our culture today who will not have anything to do with authority, and in many times it's because of bad things that have happened to them by authoritative people. Again, we can't make that conflation. And so authority is a good thing. It is a necessary thing in all of our lives. But if that authority flows out of humility, then it's going to be okay. And so characteristic number 1, humility. Number 2, authority. And then number 3 is approachable. The person is approachable. Jesus bottled up all 3 of these things. He was a humble man, full of authority, and he was approachable, as you see children sitting on his lap. And so think about a pastor or any leader or any Christian maturing and growing into Christ-likeness. There will be humility there that is foundational. There will be some kind of authoritative leadership, directiveness in their lives, regardless of what their station of life is. We always have people under us that we are leading, guiding, loving, caring for. Even if it's a discipleship context, there is an amount of authority there. And that is a good thing if it's flowing out of a heart of humility. And then that disciplee will come to you because you are approachable. The authority doesn't matter. He respects the authority. He approaches you because he's not afraid of you because of a heart of humility. And so if your pastor embodies these 3 characteristics of humility, authority, and approachability, well, then what I would appeal to you to do is to go to him the next time you see him and say, I thank God for you. I just want to encourage you. I thank you that God has brought you to our church, and that you and the leadership team, if there is one, that you all are leading us. I just appreciate the work that God is doing in your life, and I'm glad that I am a recipient of it. If you have any questions about this episode review, please ask those. You can go to our ministry's websites. We are there all day long. We're a dialogue ministry, and we'd love to talk to you about this series from Christianity Today or anything else that's on your heart.